Welcome to Tomorrow's Cities podcast, a series of conversations on urbanization and disaster risk reduction created by the Tomorrow's Cities Hub, a 5-year interdisciplinary research project working internationally to foster a transition from crisis management to multi-hazard risk-informed urban planning in cities of the Global South. Today, we're diving into a crucial aspect of urban resilience, fostering risk awareness through inclusive risk communication. During Tomorrow's Cities activities, risk agreement is one of the final and most vital components. Our approach involves a series of activities designed to empower participants to evaluate the urban scenarios they've created, now informed by computational hazard simulations that predict the social and physical impacts of hazards such as earthquakes and floods. But appraising these modeled results can be challenging, due to both the complexity of interpreting the data and the fundamental difficulty in understanding risk concepts. To address these challenges, Tomorrow's Cities conducts workshops using an interactive risk dashboard, allowing participants to explore and evaluate different choices and policies. But communicating risk, particularly future risk, is quite challenging. So, in this episode, we're joined by Roberto Gentile, lecturer in Catastrophe Risk Modelling at University College London and Tomorrow's Cities Risk Agreement Lead, and also by Karim Aljawhari, a Post-doctoral Research Fellow at University College London and a member of the Tomorrow's Cities Nablus team. They both will share their insights and experiences in communicating risk to diverse audiences and discuss strategies to enhance public understanding of risk. Due to professional commitments, Tanvi Deshpande from the London School of Economics and Political Science, who also did extensive work for this stage of the Tomorrow's Cities framework, couldn't join us. Still, we'd like to thank her for her work and dedication to the project. My name is Sergio Sprancinha and I'm the Hub's Communications Officer. For more information about our project, please visit tomorrowcities.org. Okay, so Roberto, let's begin with you. I've noticed that in media and in popular discourse, the term risk is often used interchangeably and inaccurately. And it doesn't really reflect the technical understanding that engineers, modelers, and even policymakers have. So I would say, let's start by clarifying this. What exactly is risk?
So risk generates from an intricate process that involves many factors. And on top of this, there is also the way people perceive risk, and most importantly, people with different social characteristics, if we may say, perceive risk differently. But let's stick to the technical definition first, so anything you would use for a quantification. There are 3 components that can be identified as a minimum, and the first one is hazard. Hazard is, on the one hand, referring to the characteristics of events that may potentially generate harm or, in any case, damage or impacts. And let's consider natural hazards for simplicity. So let's say earthquakes or floods. And for an earthquake, for example, the event characteristics may refer to the frequency of different earthquakes in a given location and their intensity. Their intensity may be, for example, how much is the ground shaking at a given place. So you can understand that these 2 concepts are very, very different. So the event characteristics refer to the process as a whole, the event as a whole. Magnitude 4 earthquake in this place versus magnitude 7 earthquake in this other fault. Versus intensity, which is how much the ground shakes, which is for the same event spatially distributed. So close to the event, you will have higher shaking. Further away, you will have lower shaking. All of this refers to an ideal case in which there are no built infrastructure, there are no people. And we use technically the term exposure to define these 2 concepts. So exposure refers to the assets or the people that may be affected by the hazard. So exposure refers to where buildings are, for example, and I would say how the buildings are. Is the building tall? Is the building short? Is the building old? Is the building new? And so forth. Or the people. How many people there are in a specific community? And are these people old, young, male, female, and so forth? Do they go to school? Do they go to work? And so forth. So characterization of the people and assets refers to exposure. Finally, the next bit is vulnerability. Vulnerability is, technically speaking, the probability of pieces of exposure, so either people or buildings, assets, infrastructures, the probability of buildings and infrastructure to be affected, to generate damage and therefore impacts, for example, economic losses, for example, disruptions in functionality of a service or infrastructure, given that where the infrastructure is, where the building is, where the person is, the shaking, or in general, the intensity, is of a given amount. So putting all of it together, hazard generates intensity. Intensity is of a given value where some kinds of exposure are, and this kind of exposure are affected, or let's say are characterized by a higher or a lower vulnerability. If you compose all of this together, you can define how much damage, lost functionality, or in general impacts, referring to, for example, displaced population, unemployment as a result of the events, and so forth, even economic damage if you want, to define risk.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a really good explanation. Can you just elaborate a bit more, just before we go into other issues? Can you just elaborate a bit more on how you exactly, as an engineer, how do you quantify? What are there specific methods to quantify each of these things? I would say I can imagine that it's probably easier to quantify a hazard like an earthquake or a flood using a computational model these days than probably it is to quantify the vulnerability, for example, because it relates to, especially social vulnerability, because it relates to populations and people are much more complex than fixed systems like a building or even a hazard. So can you elaborate a bit on the techniques that you guys use to do this?
The general methodology that we have, I guess, in all mathematical problems, is to divide et impera, in the sense that you can try to unpack the problem, risk in this case, in as many smaller pieces as possible. Therefore, you can use within every box, let's say, these pieces should be as much as possible independent from each other. And therefore, you can, within each box, you can understand which data do you have, how do you use it to make sure that you constrain your model to this data. And most importantly, you want to respect the physics involved in these processes. If an earthquake is expected from a fault that has a certain length, the magnitude of that earthquake cannot exceed a certain amount. This is just an example of a model that would respect the physics of the process, and it's important to respect that. Then other examples for the exposure point of view, you would like to know in a given region, using, for example, census data, which kind of buildings do you have? Which kind of infrastructure do you have? Which kind of people? How many and which kind of people? you have in this area, what's their age, what's their occupation, and so forth and so forth. Of course, census data can be really useful. It is in general, but you can only rely on it at a certain scale, which is a large scale kind of analysis. So it's also important to understand, what do I want to quantify? If my area of interest is very large, I cannot possibly go everywhere in this area and collect all the data that I need, but I may accept a certain level of error or uncertainty or both, and use census data. Vulnerability, you take the best expertise in, which is generally an engineering kind of expertise, because you need to understand how assets work when you talk about physical vulnerability. And you would like to understand scenarios like, forget about the hazard, forget about the exposure. I have one piece of asset in a specific place. What happens if I have a flood of a meter? What happens if I have a flood of 2 meters? And therefore, you can simulate using the best understanding of the engineering and the physics of the asset to understand what is the level of damage, what is the level of lost functionality, what is the level of economic losses or disruption in terms of displaced population and so forth. Plus, finally, there is another important point, which is social vulnerability, which is like, okay, let's assume in the same building, there are two different kind of people that have different social characteristics, for example, related to their ability or disability. And therefore, in the same flood event, a person that has reduced mobility would be more likely to be a casualty because they don't have enough time to go out of the building and save themselves, versus a person with full mobility, which likely has a higher chance of evacuating and therefore not being a casualty. So again, vulnerability is how likely is a given person with given characteristics to be resulting in a casualty, in a displaced person, or so forth and so forth. And this is social vulnerability.
Well, it seems to me, from what Roberto just said, that compared to the general definition of risk, the way engineers, geoscientists, and urban planners define it is more nuanced and complex. And with this in mind, I'd like to bring in Karim into the discussion to share his thoughts on this distinction. Karim, do you perceive a significant difference between the public's understanding and discussion of risk versus the way you, as an engineer and technical professionals, approach and discuss this concept?
I think the main challenge in risk, and this is something that we constantly encounter, is that it has a very probabilistic and uncertain nature, while people in reality might be looking for more solid or concrete answers about risk, like when the earthquake is going to happen, how much is going to be the magnitude, what's the exact amount of loss. And this is somehow, I mean, despite the advancements that we achieve, despite everything that has been developed until now, no one can give you a definite or concrete answer about this. So we've been always struggling with communicating that to people, and you always need to look for the most simple terms, the easiest metrics that measure the impact of hazards on people and communities in order to deliver the right idea to people. And if you don't do that, you basically break the chain of communication. And instead of trying to make risk awareness increase among the community, it's going to stay within the scientific community, the engineers, the urban planners, the earthquake experts, or the hazard experts in general. And this is one of the things that we constantly try to improve within the risk agreement part of tomorrow's cities.
Here, Karim is referring to the fourth stage of the Tomorrow's Cities decision support environment. This framework has been developed and tested in 9 cities across the global south, aiming to shape more inclusive, risk-informed future cities. In the risk agreement stage, city stakeholders explore how policy choices in various urban configurations can either mitigate or exacerbate risks. For more information, visit our website at tomorrowcities.org. Well, before we delve into the specifics of Tomorrow's Cities, I want to highlight a key point about the notion of risk that I think Karim just mentioned. And I'll give you an example. Portugal, particularly Lisbon, experienced a massive earthquake in the 18th century, in 1755. The event is considered a precursor of much of modern seismic engineering, and I think we can consider that it led to some of the first known anti-seismic structures, at least in the West. Despite this history, if you ask anyone in the streets currently, I would say that probably most people in Lisbon are largely unaware of the concept of earthquake risk. They might acknowledge that there is a potential hazard. Well, they've heard about the 1755 earthquake. It's told in the history books, and we hear much about it every year when on the 1st of November, that's when it happened. But it doesn't really influence their decisions, such as choosing a house, for example. In my case, as a geologist, when I selected my house, I consciously avoided areas close to the sea. I chose a higher elevation. I checked geological maps to ensure that the foundations were built on stable rock to minimize shaking. However, this level of awareness is quite uncommon, I would say. And I think probably most people don't consider these factors when choosing a house. So my issue is this gap in understanding means that the critical knowledge engineers, geologists, and technicians possess is not reaching the broader community and even policymakers. As a consequence, it fails to become a priority in political discourse. So my question to you, and you can both answer this, is what can be done to bridge this gap and ensure that essential knowledge about risk informs public and policy decisions?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And, when it comes to risks that might happen in the future and might not happen in the future, things are getting more difficult because we as people are probably more programmed to deal with something that's happening right now, more perceivable, something that we can feel, something that we can see, so that we develop our own awareness when it comes to seismic risk. But when you talk about 50 years ahead, 100 years ahead, that's very difficult to perceive and to take into account, even when it comes to risk decisions or risk management decisions. Like many people will say, okay, who cares what's going to happen after 100 years? Why do I care? I'm not going to be even alive on that day. And it's very difficult also to think, what about my grandchildren? What about my great grandchildren, and so on? It's not something easy that you can feel. And that's the problem. If things are not communicated in lay terms, in a way that make the awareness exist inside of people, regardless of their level of education or socioeconomic status, then they will never take these kind of aspects into account. As you said, Sergio, when it comes to choosing a house, identifying an appropriate location that has less hazard or less risk in general. So this is, I think, the most major issue that steps in between us as experts, for example, and the general public when it comes to making decisions about mitigating risk. So communication is the key, in my opinion.
I agree with what Karim mentioned, of course, and I would only add let's say, a quantitative dimension to this, in the sense that I would start from experiences in the community where, when we were talking about earthquakes, people would completely refer to us and trust us and ask us as the experts. While when it referred to floods or landslides, community members were much more aware of what was going on and how to react to it and how to prevent issues as a result of these events. And the explanation of this is very simple. Earthquakes happen much less frequently than floods, or small floods, if you want, and small landslides. And therefore, this first of all shows how communities are very, very keen to listen, but they are also very, very keen to participate when they know. It's very nice. It was very a very interesting learning point for us. And this is one point from the social side. From the technical side, I would say that going to the priorities and how important is a given earthquake or a given flood or a given landslide in the context of the life of a person and what are the needs of this person or this family, this household. Of course, this frequency, or let's say mean frequency, of having a big earthquake or having a big flood plays a big role there, because if you have a flood that is just 2 centimeters worth of depth of water, but it happens every rainy season, then it's super relevant for the community. And an earthquake, they don't know it's relevant, because the smaller earthquakes, they cannot even feel, and they are not engineering, they are not relevant from an engineering point of view, because they don't cause any harm. So our role is to, first of all, tell communities that the same hazard type can happen at different intensity values and levels. And therefore, our job is to use science and available evidence to show communities what common sense cannot give you in the first place. And therefore, finally, the timeline is very important, because priorities are not just an issue of individual people or individual households, but governments and local governments. And of course, local governments in many cases are, let's say, have a length of a few years, 4, 5, whatever it is. And now, what is the probability of having a massive earthquake within your political time? And therefore, this number is very low. Politicians know that. And therefore, what if I invest into this to reduce potential losses due to the next big event, for earthquake, let's say, what is the potential benefit I will get during my term? Is very low, because again, it's so probabilistic. So our job is to make sure that the communities know that even though these numbers are low, when it happens, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, it will be relevant. And that's why it's very important to look at longer time frames, where you can also account for the fact that some hazards are increasing in frequency, in intensity, because of climate change, for example, or because population is growing, and therefore the hazard is the same, but since exposure grows, more people, more buildings, more assets, more infrastructure, therefore your risk will increase in the future. And yeah, this is our role as, let's say, technical communicators.
Thank you, Roberto. I think you really set the stage with your last points, bringing in the community aspect of risk communication. I believe that we are at a good juncture at the moment where communication isn't just one directional. It's not just engineers, geologists, and other technical experts communicating to the audience. Instead, we are more and more valuing this interchange of knowledge between communities and those technical experts, and creating a productive environment for learning and change. And actually, this is something that we discussed with our colleagues in the last episode of the Tomorrow Cities podcast with Max Hope, Ekin Akichi, and Michelle Waholm. And I suggest everyone to go and have a listen to it. And the idea of making change happen in these regions is very much dependent on the ability of communities to participate in the process. So before we dive into the details of your experiences with Tomorrow Cities, I have one last question. What role do you think community engagement plays in the process of communicating risk, and how can we foster this more effectively? I'll add another question so that I don't have to then intervene again and let you answer freely. Additionally, I would love to know, how do you think that cultural and socioeconomic factors influence the perception and communication of risk in different urban settings? Maybe we can start with Roberto, and then Karim can add to it. And after that, we'll discuss your specific experience in Palestine, Karim, which I think will be very interesting for everyone who's listening.
Yeah, I would like to first repeat what I said before. So it's not just a communication that comes from us as a big speaker, and then a lot of people listening to what we say because we have the technical knowledge and we go there to disseminate and communicate that. That's fine, absolutely. But also communities are very much keen to contribute whenever they can. And they don't do it if they believe they can't. That's great, because it's already, a relationship of trust that you can build with them, because they listen to your technical bits when they need an answer for something that they don't really they can't really get themselves, and that's important. So as you said, it's not a one-way communication, but it's a discourse, and then it's a chat. And just to give you one example of this, as I said before, we as modelers do the best we can given our technical abilities, and we believe those are satisfactory, but also with the data that we have. And let me give you a very simple example. To define the susceptibility of a given area, and specifically different points of a given area to landslides, a key piece of information, and this is common sense, it's the slope of land at that point. Where do you get this information that is crucial for your modeling? You get it from what is called digital elevation models that are provided by big services, which may be public, which may be private, it doesn't matter. But those are, let's say, GIS, Geographic Information System models that give you, for many points in an area, what is the height. By knowing the height of many points, you can connect in a 3D surface and you can get the slope in between the points. If you get that slope wrong because the data is inaccurate for whatever reason, or it's changed over time because landscape changes, then your susceptibility for landslide in that location will be wrong. It can be underestimated or overestimated. And there was an interesting case in which it happened to us. It happened to us in Nepal, where we had, unfortunately, we had a piece of DEM, digital elevation model, that was incomplete or incorrect for whatever reason. Nobody to blame. But at some point, the local community members saw the susceptibility map. Of course, we explained the community members how to read the map. But once they did understand that, they would say, I don't believe this model. This place over here, and they were indicating with the fingers, it's like, it's flat. there's no way there is susceptibility to landslides there. And it happens that that specific place was flattened by whatever, I don't remember the details, but they knew exactly. It's like, I live there, I know that place is flat, so your model needs changed. And we said, fair enough, that happens, we do the best we can. And now that we know, please point us to all the places that are flat, and we can revise our DEM and we can revise our susceptibility modeling. So that's why the two-way communication is important.
I think that's just the perfect example of well, not just a two-way communication, a multi-way communication, I would say, because you taught people how to read the model, but then you learned from them, and then you refined your models, and then probably you went back to the community and asked them, is this correct? Does this make sense now? So it's great. And on that, I'm going to bring in Karim to talk a bit about your work in Palestine. So you are from Palestine, and you have been working in Nablus for over a year now, at least in Tomorrow Cities. Nablus has this historical experience of earthquakes, and I believe there's also some issues with flooding hazard. There's probably both an historical memory and the present day experience dealing with these hazards. Based on your personal experience and on your role as a Tomorrow Cities facilitator in Nablus, how do you think people in the city manage risk? You know, probably not in a technical way, but they find their own ways to do it. I imagine that even if they might not have this formal understanding of the risk formula, they are aware, such as Roberto was just saying, they are aware of areas in the city that are more exposed or buildings that might be more or less vulnerable. Could you share your insights on how this community knowledge is so important, and how do people find a way to manage their own risk in a popular way, so to speak?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for the question. Let me start answering that by giving just a brief history about the hazards in Nablus, because I think that's very important for audience, because I'm sure that many people haven't even heard of the city's name. So as you said, Nablus is indeed a city with a history of natural hazards. And, you know, to add insult to injury, it has also high exposure, as Roberto explained. We basically have large population density, large building density. Just imagine that the percentage of buildings between 1997 to 2017, so within the span of 20 years, has increased by at least 80 to 85%. And that's crazy. And, you know, from my experience working there and interacting with the community, I have observed together with my team a few key insights about how people can manage risk. So starting with floods. Maybe you know that Nablus experiences regular minor floods like every now and then. But to be honest, the last damaging event took place in January 2013 because the country back then was hit by a very strong winter storm with very intense rainfalls within a short period of time. And this has covered more than 40% of the total annual rainfall. So you can expect that we had a very strong flash floods that impacted more than 12,000 people in terms of direct damage to houses and agricultural lands. We got more than 200 houses completely destroyed, displaced more than 600 people at the level of the West Bank, of course. And Nablus city was among the most ones to be severely hit, because if you think about the topography of the land, we have two steep mountains and the city is built in between them. So it's a valley area. So I can say that based on people experiences, they are quite familiar with the areas that are more prone to flooding. And you could see that, for example, they avoid building low-rise residential houses in the valley areas. And most of the buildings there are probably factories and industrial facilities, so we don't expect high human loss in that area in case another flood happens. And they do that even without having a formal regulation through land use planning that prevents them from building houses there, which is fine. That's good. Now, when it comes to earthquakes, things get more interesting because the situation is actually the complete opposite. earthquakes in Nablus or in the West Bank in general is probably the most significant natural hazard that might impact the whole country. But the problem is that the last damaging earthquake event happened in 1927, which had a magnitude of, I think, 6.4, 6.5. In all cases, this earthquake has destroyed the major part of the historical city center and killed probably over 300 people. But the problem is that this major event happened almost 100 years ago. So how can you find someone who's aged more than 100 years to tell the other people about the experiences they had during that earthquake event? And that's why it's a very difficult to find appropriate risk understanding and awareness at the level of the community, just based on their day-to-day experiences. However, we had some minor shakings, ground shakings, maybe a few years ago. There was another one in 2004. These have caused some damages, but they were mainly in the historical city center, where we have like old and weak buildings. So I can say, based on that people understand that such kind of old buildings are really vulnerable. They're not going to withstand earthquakes in most of the cases. But let's be honest, no one uses them in construction anymore. The people are more used to the modern systems like steel and reinforced concrete. Now, the main surprise is that we do have seismic design regulations in place at the national level. We have also done several risk assessment studies at the university in Nablus, which is the leading in Palestine, called An-Najah National University. All these studies were led by one of our brightest scientists, Professor Jalal Dabbiq. But despite that, people are not conforming to these regulations, and they're still building highly vulnerable structures. So I can conclude by saying there is a huge gap in the formal risk knowledge and awareness at the community level. And this is where we had to step in through the frameworks and the workshops that, can help people understand the risk more through the effective communication. And of course, we can have more detailed discussion throughout our conversation about Nablus.
Thanks, Karim. I think that was a perfect explanation of the situation. And it's not just about one city, is it? It seems to be a common issue around the world. And to be honest, your point really resonates with me here in Portugal once more. You mentioned that there are regulations in place for building high-rises, but they aren't being respected. And I think that's something similar to what happens here in Portugal. It's not that people or constructions are intentionally ignoring the regulations. It's more that we simply don't know if they're being followed because, well, there's not enough enforcement agents to check compliance. We just have to trust that they are adhering to the framework. And anyway, two things came to my mind while you were talking. You mentioned that the lower areas in Nablus are mainly occupied by factories and industrial infrastructure. And Roberto previously highlighted that the importance of evaluating this interconnection between people and the built environment, which is something we'd also focus on tomorrow's cities. We actually talked about this with Jim Kremen and Jeremy Phillips in one of the episodes of this podcast. And this includes the houses that people live in, the transport infrastructure like roads, bridges, and also the workplaces that they depend on. Would you say that this interconnection between where people live, how they move, where they study, and where they work is often overlooked in risk models? This makes, obviously, the equation much more complex. For example, you might live in an earthquake-resistant building, but if your workplace is destroyed, it obviously creates a problem because you become unemployed, right? So you might not be an immediate victim of the event, but you become a victim of its aftermath. And I have a feeling that this aspect is often not accounted for. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
I fully agree with you. And the situation in Nablus, and I assume in most cities around the world, maybe especially in the global south, the urban planning process that regulates the land uses, that regulates where people are allowed to build and where they're not allowed to build, the type of the buildings, their height, their use, their occupancy. I mean, the process that we are doing in Nablus is very basic. It just determines what type of use for the land, determines probably the height of the building, but the process is completely risk insensitive. And this is a huge problem because you might end up having low-rise residential buildings in an area subjected to high flooding. In Nablus City, for instance, in the commercial city center, we have clay soil, which is, it's not stiff, it's very weak soil. And all the high-rise buildings that are used for commercial purposes and offices are built on that area. So when an earthquake comes and there's going to be a magnification of the seismic waves due to the type of the soil, the buildings with the with a large number of floors are going to be the most ones impacted. And when such buildings get collapsed or get high damage levels, it's going to be catastrophic. But does the municipality or the urban planning agencies take that into account? No, for them, this is just a commercial area, which means that you're allowed to build up to, let's say, 20 or 25 stories, but without taking the risk into account that comes from the nature of the ground or the soil there. You can't really arrive at a stage where the urban planning becomes an effective tool in order to reduce risk. And again, this is one of the aspects that we worked hard on increasing the awareness, not only at the community level, but also at the decision-making level. Because if things don't start from the decision makers, then it's going to be a very hard way towards achieving an actual improvement in the resilience or disaster risk reduction.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was getting at, what I wanted you to talk about, this seemingly disconnection between reality on the ground, or the risk reality on the ground, and policy making and decision making. Roberto, I see you agreeing there with both me and Karim there, so do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think this connection, it's twofold. One gives a twofold, let's say, learning or reflection. And one is that on our side, our models need to account for the mechanics that we want to account for, in the sense that if you want to estimate the number of people that will have will become jobless after an event, you need to make sure that your model is able to appreciate these kind of effects. And as you said, a person in a specific area is not just a person in a building where they live, but it's also a person that goes to a specific hospital when needed, or a specific GP when needed, a specific school if they are students, a specific workplace, and so forth. And what I would also say to specific neighbors, because there's also a social kind of infrastructure, if you want, or network, social network that you need to account for. For example, this is very important for displacement. So if you have your house affected by flood, but you have a member of your family or a friend, anybody that can host you, then, okay, you have temporarily lost your house because you need to clean what the flood has created to your house. But at that time, you're not displaced because you have a social network that is able to support you. So you need to account for it, make sure that your model accounts for it if you want to appreciate the effects of displacement of certain events. And in general, it's, again, all these kind of utilities or services that people use. And I would say the road between them. That's important, because even if your house is fine and your workplace is fine, if the road in front of the workplace is not functioning because there's a massive crack due to an earthquake, or there's a sink created by liquefaction, I don't know, you still cannot go there. Or even if you can go, maybe import-export, or let's say transportation of goods, is not available. So there's a business interruption. So you could even go there, but you cannot do your job. So you're jobless anyways. So there's a big shift in risk modeling in the community, in the scientific community, that comes from this need. We are not anymore interested in economic losses only. And that's been the key or the focus of many risk models over time, or I would say in the past, from when they were first used. They were first used by insurance companies and reinsurance companies, probably in the late 70s or 80s. Now, there's a shift saying it's not enough. Economic loss does not mean the same thing to different people. So we want to have what in tomorrow's cities we call people-centered impact metrics, which are not only related to economic loss, but to access to services, work, school, hospital, and so forth, displacement, and so forth. Now, if this is the need, and it is because many international frameworks are asking for it, many governments are looking into this kind of risk estimates that are more people-centric, then the scientific community reacted to that by creating better models that can appreciate these mechanics, and therefore don't only output economic losses, but they also output displacement of population, job lost, school or education continuity, or whatever, you name it. As long as you have the need for it, you ask your modeler to make sure that the model accounts for the mechanics, so that input earthquake or input hazard can result in output impact metric.
Well, that's great, Roberto. Thanks for the explanation. I think you really provided a good insight on this aspect of Tomorrow Cities, which is creating more inclusive, realistic impact metrics or risk assessments. And you were also taking the conversation exactly where I wanted to go, into Tomorrow Cities and what we do in the project. On that note, I invite everyone to listen to episode 3 of the podcast with Gemma Kremen and Jeremy Phillips, where we discussed in more detail what Roberto was just mentioning about producing people-centered impact metrics in Tomorrow Cities. And I find something very interesting in the project, which is exactly this approach, the people-centered approach. But for this to work, people need to understand the risks they face. And well, they probably understand the hazards because they experience them, like the floods Karim just mentioned. And in Tomorrow Cities, we created an amazing interactive tool and methods to communicate risk, helping people to understand the risks they face, but also how policy choices and urban configurations can either increase or decrease risk. Could you talk more about the role of these interactive tools, like the risk dashboard that we use, and how they might enhance risk communication and communities' understanding of risk? And, well, this question can either go through Karim or Roberto, so who wants to start?
Well, I can start. I think this is very good that you mentioned the work by Gemma and Jerry that led a terrific team of hazard modelers and vulnerability modelers and in general risk modelers.
A brief interruption to Roberto's explanation to provide a quick insight into Tomorrow Cities methodology. Our work starts by gathering diverse stakeholders and working with them to understand their visions and aspirations for their ideal, low-risk future cities. In the initial engagements, these stakeholder groups draft land use plans and select policies in line with these visions and aspirations. These plans and policies are then translated into digital land use models and tested against natural hazards relevant to the study area. This stage, called the Hazard and Impact Modeling stage, characterizes the physical and social impacts of future natural hazard events on the land use plans, or the cities, created by the stakeholders. From this work, our research team derives a set of impact metrics that assess the extent and scale of impacts resulting from future natural hazard events. Now, let's get back to Roberto.
And now imagine that you have these massive, rich data sets that can provide an estimate, very rich estimate of risks in a specific context. And now the job is, how do you transfer this kind of information so that relevant communities that normally don't have this kind of technical understanding and knowledge, normally, how to transfer that information and make sure that community members are able to use it to influence decision making? Because now imagine we are not only talking about this very complicated process of risk generation, but on top of this, we are mixing it with urban planning. By definition, if you do urban planning, the stuff that you have on your papers or in general in your computers, in your GIS, does not exist because you're designing for it. So on top of all the complications, you also have the fact that you are looking into the future of a specific community. And therefore, the buildings in these maps, the infrastructure, the roads, the hospitals, whatever you name it, they don't exist yet. So on the one hand, this is scary, but on the other hand, this is an opportunity, because if you have a very rich estimation of risk, then you can influence decision making. So if you don't like the amount of risk, if the amount of risk of a given scenario, urban scenario, given the hazards that are relevant there, is too high for whatever reason, because the community has decided it's too high. And the community also includes the local government, so the policymakers with the people, the communities at risk, let's say, then you can influence that. What if we change the position of that hospital so that it's less prone to being non-functional after a flood or after an earthquake? What if we change how that hospital is built so that even if it's not moved and the hazard is the same, the vulnerability changes and therefore risk changes? So our job is to take all this kind of information in this very complicated design setting and make sure that the community members are able to use it. And this is what risk agreement is about. I will let you wander on the name risk agreement before I explain why we call it that way. But the idea is that we have provided an interactive kind of set of activities in which, instead of going to the community with a lecture about our risk modeling and say, okay, now you listen to us for 3 hours, we give you all the details, and then you do whatever you want. Instead of doing that, we have provided a gamified, allow me the term, approach, in which step by step, we have small activities that the communities are running in different groups. I'm sure in the first episode you mentioned about how our groups are selected. Just quickly, it's about making sure that the groups represent some specific characteristics that can be cultural, that can be social, that can be whatever. So we may have a group of women, we may have a group of business owners, we can have a group of elderly, we can have a group of marginalized communities of any kind. It depends on the context. The idea is that by having these groups working in parallel, they can freely express their opinions and influence decision making without too much power imbalance across them. Now, the activities of the risk agreement workshop build on these groups, number one. Number two, the risk assessments. And number three, we also use a dashboard that allows us to simply in the easiest way we could ever think of, allow the communities to navigate these very complicated and rich risk modeling results. And the workshop is divided in 3 parts. The first part is about small activities to learn how to use the dashboard. So let's say it's a tutorial. Let's say this is how you look at a risk map. Let's see what you see, how you interpret it, and then do you have questions? And then you get what hazard means in the dashboard. Then you do the same for exposure, then you do the same for physical vulnerability and social vulnerability. And every time you have a little checkpoint, you can make sure that until the community group is happy to move on, you don't. They ask questions until they are happy, you don't move on. At the end of this phase, the tutorial, you are somehow sure that the community members are able to use our tool. They are able to ask the questions that are relevant for them so that they can influence the decision making. Second bit is, in fact, the appraisal of how an urban scenario, and by the way, every group has their own urban scenario that they have developed. But all of a sudden, we have run the risk modeling for it. And therefore, we can understand finally what are the implications in terms of risk. And risk is impact metrics that are people-centered. What are the implications of their decision in terms of land use, in terms of building allocations, in terms of services allocation, and you name it, in terms of how much risk is generated due to that. Now, with the tool and with the ability of learning the tool, of using the tool, they are able to say, what's going on here? There's a lot of people displaced in this specific area. Let's understand why. Is it because of their houses? Let's check. Probably not. Is it because of the hazard is too high? Let's check. Maybe not. Is it because of the workplace? Oh, yes, maybe yes. So let's have a look at the workplace then, and let's see what we can do to improve the urban scenario. So let's change the workplace. Do we move it? Do we improve it in terms of vulnerability? We reduce the vulnerability, and we can say, okay, we want this modification in our scenario. And to do this, every person in the group, although the group is nominally homogeneous, of course, people have different opinions, different perceptions, different sensitivities, and they can influence each other. So everybody learns from everybody else, including the local governments, and therefore, at the end of it, they kind of share an understanding of risk. What risk means is now co-developed by them, or if you want, agreed by them. And that's why, since we believe this is the most important piece of the methodology that allows effective decision-making that is inclusive and equitable, since this is the most important bit, we called this methodology risk agreement, although it's much more. We have other activities, but I will let Karim give his opinion on it from a context-specific point of view.
Karim, what impact did the workshops and this methodology that Roberto just described have on Nablus community? What have you observed from what they've learned, and what lessons can be applied to address the issues we discussed earlier and you described so well?
That's actually probably the most interesting part when we talk about the context of Nablus, because it's very important to see how people change perspectives and how now they think about risk. Let me start by saying that, our experience in Nablus has been very rewarding but challenging at the same time. You know that with, at least from our community, the typical mentality is always initial skepticism and resistance to new methods and tools. And especially when we talk about, risk with its probabilistic and uncertain nature, things are getting more complex, especially that people are programmed to deal with immediate and visible risks rather than something that might happen within the next 30, 40, or 50 years. Things were not the easiest, but we managed to make it at the end of the day. I would mention what Roberto has just explained, which is that the dashboard that we used has been very instrumental in the process, because it helped us visualize the data in a way that people were very interested, and they wanted even to use it themselves rather than us lecturing them how to use it. We also tried in our risk estimates to use scenarios that have happened in the past. So we used a historical earthquake that had a magnitude over 7. It happened probably 300 years ago. And when people had some skepticism about why did you use that scenario, it might not happen again, we told them, look at Turkey and Syria earthquake. The 7.8 magnitude earthquake that happened in February 2023 actually happened exactly with the same magnitude in the 1700s. So we could be the next. So after visualizing all the data and the risk impacts that we calculated and the scenarios, in my opinion, we have achieved impacts, huge impacts, going back to your question. So for the people, I think it was the first time they were exposed to real data about their city and about their buildings. And many of them said, we've never seen something similar before in our lives, because they are used to, as Roberto said, the traditional boring lectures that sometimes don't end up anywhere. And, to make somehow a deeper understanding of the situation and of the risk, we assumed in our calculations that the buildings to be constructed in the future are exactly the same weak buildings that people are using right now, that have no earthquake design, and they are highly susceptible to damage. And this was very important for us because it connects, the future in this case will be connected with the present reality that the people are living right now. So we did the assessment in this case. And after that, we repeated the assessment, assuming that the buildings are going to be properly designed and have, some seismic resistance. And I heard people saying, we have never realized that seismic design could be that much of an importance when it comes to increasing resilience and to reduce losses. And the fact that we have also used metrics that measure the impacts of earthquakes and the consequences that are, closer to the perception of people and community, like the number of children that have no access to education, people have no access to health services, number of unemployed people, the fatalities, the people who will be displaced. Things were much easier to understand, and this has been, in my opinion, the most rewarding part is that people started thinking like, okay, we need to look at risk. We need to consider that into our choices in the future, even if it's like something that might happen in the next 30 or 40 or 50 years, because the impacts are actually very severe. So we hope like to translate that at a larger scale, because, we considered a limited number of groups, like maybe 25 to 30 people in total, but we are planning to transfer that at the national level. And of course, this requires the contribution of the decision makers, not only us as individual initiative or Tomorrow Cities initiative, but we could see that communicating risk can become a reality that increase the awareness of people rather than just staying as something communicated between experts and decision makers.
It's such a great thing to hear how crucial the communication aspect has been for Tomorrow Cities, and more specifically for the work that you've been doing in Nablus and, I suppose in the other cities as well. It really is something that resonates with one of the key aspects that Tomorrow Cities has always had as a priority. And on that note, would you agree that Tomorrow Cities has developed an effective approach? Not perfect, of course, but certainly robust in helping people not only to understand the technical concepts, but also actively participating in creating low-risk future for urban development. This idea that, as Roberto mentioned, people have a voice and can contribute to shaping future cities seems like a promising way forward. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, actually, I have to say that Tomorrow Cities taught me and taught the Nablus team that, regardless of the complexity of scientific concepts, there should be a way to communicate them to people, regardless of their socioeconomic status and level of education, because, people are smart and they can provide us with valuable insights, like what Roberto has mentioned in the case of landslides. So before we blame people for the lack of understanding or lack of awareness, let's try to see if we manage to communicate risk well to them before we try to make any judgment. And as you said, Sergio, there is nothing perfect, but I think that Tomorrow Cities has achieved a great, significant advancement when it comes to communicating risk to people and to make them engaged and to make them interact with the results and see the effects of different decisions and different land use planning on the future risk in terms of the different metrics we just discussed about.
Well, I had a couple of additional questions, but I think we've hit the sweet spot here, so I don't think I'll ask these questions. We've covered the lessons learned, experiences from Tomorrow Cities, and we've discussed how, as Karim pointed out, that we shouldn't make assumptions about populations and communities. They not only learn, but can also teach us about their own experiences, and these experiences can be very relevant for the way we assess risk, for example. So, but looking ahead, do you think this approach is the way forward? What innovations or improvements do you see as crucial for the future of risk modeling, especially in the realm of risk communication in urban planning?
I think that, again, as you said, nothing is perfect, but to answer your previous question, our answer is a qualified yes. And to look at the future, we are now in the best position to, first of all, understand what the scientific community takes from this, because we know for sure that our deployments were successful in one way or another, different dimensions of success. But we are now in the best position of having our papers out so that the scientific community can feedback on this. And I would say that one very good point that we started working on, it's part of our methodology, but I think that there are very good ways forward and ways, let's say, avenues to explore, is the third part of our methodology, which the risk agreement methodology, which is about a reality check, if you want. Because what I discussed before, up to when the community members require revisions of their urban scenarios because they want to reduce risk, and now they know how to reduce risk, happens within the model. But as we said, this is a conversation. It's not just a one-way speaking or a monologue, let's say. So in the third part of the activities, the participants are able to prioritize a small number of revisions of the scenario and have an exercise that goes beyond the model, beyond the assumptions, beyond the uncertainties. And the question is, let's assume I want to change whatever. I want to change all the hospitals in a specific way. I don't mind the details now. It depends on the group. Let's assume that we are now putting in place, in reality, today, this change. What can happen? Can we have challenges from a social point of view? People not being happy, maybe because they are living in specific zones and you would put an hospital there. Would it be a governmental challenge or political challenge? So there is not enough money, there is not enough political will or whatever. And so the third part of the activities is really a facilitated discussion that does not use the model anymore. It goes beyond it and asks the question, okay, I want to implement it in the real life, what are the challenges, number one. Number two, who are the potential actors involved with solving these challenges, and what are the potential solutions that we can suggest them. And this is a part that, in my opinion, should feed back into our modeling. We haven't done it yet. We have taken the feedback, the specific feedback on how to change urban landscape and so forth, and put it back into the model, recalculate it again, and reassess risk and blah, blah, blah. But we want to go beyond. So changing the mechanics of our models, because we want to account for these challenges and we want to appreciate. This is, in my opinion, one way forward. And I would close, let's say, this with one quote from a participant in RAPTI that said, "I have never touched a laptop in my life, and I was so confident in using the dashboard. I struggled a little bit at first, but I was able to use it afterwards."
Wow, thanks for sharing that, Roberto. This sentence should probably be highlighted right at the top of a website, shouldn't it? I feel that it really condensates how Tomorrow Cities has challenged these traditional practices in urban planning and how we've embraced the importance of multi-way communication. It's such a powerful message, isn't it? I really liked it. Thank you for sharing. And well, we've reached the end of our time. We've actually went a bit over the time, but the conversation has been excellent. Thank you both for joining me in this insightful discussion. Do you have any final remarks you'd like to share, Karim and Roberto?
First, I want to thank you, Sergio, for giving us this opportunity to talk and express our thoughts about the great experiences we had. Nablus has been a very special case for me because it's my home country, it's my hometown. So doing the work and seeing my people interacting with me and with the other experts has been so much rewarding. I would hope, like in the future, to see these kind of interactive risk agreements and so on to be deployed at the national level. I would like to see more interdisciplinary collaboration because Tomorrow Cities has demonstrated that whenever we have collaboration that involves urban planners, people, engineers, social scientists, communication experts, the results would be much more effective because eventually we're planning to reduce the disaster and manage it. And without achieving this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, I think achieving this target would be much more difficult. So once we start investing in this kind of collaboration, once we invest in education and capacity buildings and, try to involve people in the process, things are going to start getting much better in terms of much better in terms of resilience. So things are going to become at a national level rather than individual, let's say, initiatives that start well but don't end up anywhere. So that's the last thing I just wanted to say, and thanks a lot for having us.
I will join to this message of thanking you, Sergio, for this. This has been very nice and a very nice experience. And in general, I think I would provide my appreciation to Tomorrow Cities that allowed me to stretch so much from dealing with the structural engineering with beams, columns, and walls to doing something I would never think I would be doing, let alone as a job. So I would really like to appreciate Tomorrow Cities for this opportunity.
Well, I'm sure Tomorrow Cities management and all that will be hearing these things. So, and I'm very happy for you to have joined us here. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for joining us, Karim, Roberto, and to everyone who's listening. Well, we'll see you next time on another episode of Tomorrow Cities podcast. Thank you very much. For more information on the project, visit tomorrowcities.org and follow us on X, LinkedIn, and YouTube.